It's time for a remake of one of our earliest videos. This time, we're taking on Pokemon's four-armed answer to Arnold Schwarzenegger. None other than Machamp. A favorite since Generation 1, back in the day, it was one of those Pokemon whose imposing presence signified the danger of their trainer. Think Giovanni, think Elite Four Bruno. Nowadays, who knows? Maybe it's that Pokemon that reminds you to get back in the gym, so that you too can throw 500 punches a second, if the Pokedex is to be believed. Not saying we doubt Champ's strength or anything, but each fist throwing 125 punches in a second sounds a little wild. Regardless, we're going to see if brute strength was enough for the Machampinator to find success in the competitive scene. And so, we ask, how great was Machamp actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. With Generation 1 as dominated as it is by the normal type trio of Tauros, Snorlax, and Chansey, one would think the only type in the game to hit them super effectively would have some use, and since Machamp had the highest attack of all fighting types, players naturally turned to it. Plus, you hit Rhydon super effectively, what's not to like? Sadly, Machamp could not salvage even a slight niche. It was a gimmick through and through, and not even a decent one. Why? Number 1 is obvious. Gen 1 is also dominated by psychic types, which completely dunk on Machamp. Sure, it's got a great attack stat, so can't it do something with Body Slam and Hyper Beam? Nope, it just doesn't hit hard enough. A problem it also has with its fighting stat. Submission is 80 base power, which isn't bad, but not amazing. The fact that it is an unlikely 24.7 chance for it to 2-hit KO Rhydon is downright depressing. But what really makes it such an awful choice is the recoil it incurs, 1/4 of the damage dealt, which cuts into Machamp's bulk. That is already, not great. Oh, and it's got 80% accuracy. Not worth the headache for a move that isn't exactly doing massive damage, but at least sometimes you'll miss and not give yourself any recoil damage. Yeah, it's terrible. Machamp's disappointing power means it's not even that reliable at threatening the normals like it's supposed to. You need much bigger numbers from Machamp than the barely over half range it's supposedly threatening Snorlax with. The alternative, Low Kick, which is a mere 50 base power in Gen 1, but also packs a nice 30% flinch rate, which can theoretically be useful alongside paralysis. The downside, Machamp is even weaker than it already is in exchange for a better dice roll. It wouldn't even 2-hit KO Tauros, and it wouldn't even 3-hit KO Rhydon. But then again, using Machamp was already a dice roll. If you're picking between two terrible poisons, you may as well use the one that tasted slightly less awful going down. There's always someone who thinks they're smart enough to figure out Machamp, and then they eventually reach the same conclusion. It is in fact awful. If you really want to destroy paralyzed teams, just use Rhydon, one of the best Pokemon in the game, who also counters Zapdos, another one of the best Pokemon in the game. Oh, and incidentally, Zapdos destroys Machamp as well, since Machamp doesn't have Rock Slide in Gen 1. Yeah, and these same issues plague Machamp in UU and NU as well, which is why it is untiered in Generation 1. It's so disappointing because it seems so rife with potential, and then it just can't follow through. Fortunately, Generation 2 turned the Machamp ship around in a hurry. It received a much better stab move, Cross Chop, whose 80% accuracy would still raise an eyebrow, but whose 100 base power was much better compensation, and just as importantly, Submission's recoil was gone. In its place was an increased critical hit rate of 20% when factoring in accuracy. That wasn't all either. Machamp gained crucial coverage in Rock Slide and Hidden Power, and not one but two ways to boost its attack in Curse and Meditate. Additionally, the splitting of its special stat gave it a highly respectable base 85 special defense. Beyond just the buffs to Champ itself, it also benefited from a metagame where yes, Snorlax was on every team, but also Psychics were no longer on top, and part of the reason for that was the addition of Dark and Steel types, which Machamp utterly destroyed. Now, using Machamp wasn't easy. It was far from a lax check given its inability to switch into its normal stab, and its defensive profile was not amazing in general, especially when stepping on spikes, even with leftovers to help itself out. On offense, the 8 PP on Cross Chop could disappear quickly if one wasn't careful, and its speed stat was underwhelming. With the right support and when played well though, Machamp was one of the most unrelenting, vicious Pokemon around. Curse 3 attacks Champ became one of the metagame's defining threats. Its powerful, boosted stab Cross Chop, one of the best tools for blasting through stall teams that dominated the metagame, since the best physical wall in the game, Skarmory, was far from safe into into it, while actual fighting resists weren't exactly doing the job either. Champ could either enlist the support of a pursuit using teammate or simply rip through them itself. It always came prepared for Zapdos with Rock Slide, and then in the last slot, it most commonly enjoyed Earthquake for Nidoking, Gengar, and the far more reliable choice against Raikou. However, if pursuit support couldn't be enlisted, Hidden Power Bug was also a standard to let Champ clock what would otherwise be a perfect answer in Exeggutor, while maintaining a valuable super effective slam against Starmie, since Starmie was also tasked with spinning the spikes away from Champ's teammate Cloyster. Cloyster often lured Starmie in and either blew it up, or the preferable option, since it could allow for the maintaining of spikes in the long run, toxic the Starmie, as once Starmie was poisoned, it was far less effective into Champ. Also useful for this purpose was HP Ghost, which Machamp could run to ensure Misdreavus stood no chance against it, while also having a harder smack into Gengar and still being able to hit Egg. Mostly niche but genuinely good was Hidden Power Flying, which still hit Egg but also targeted Heracross, a rarer but potentially incredibly annoying wall for many of the offensive teams Machamp found itself on. Beyond Earthquake and Hidden Powers, Machamp could sometimes slot in some unusual but valuable choices. Fire Blast, letting it immediately threaten Skarmory and still hit Exeggutor, while also gaining the ability to one-hit KO Fortress, incredibly valuable for Machamp's team, which wanted to minimize Fortress's opportunities to spin away their spikes. Sometimes Machamp didn't even attack in that last slot, but went with Light Screen. Suddenly, Zapdos' Thunders were bouncing off, and it was nice team support before Machamp was ready to go for the sweep itself, or even Protect, which was superb for letting Machamp wrangle every inch of Leftovers recovery and make itself much more difficult to take out in the process. This was a massive boon for a Pokemon whose longevity was so famously suspect. Sometimes Machamp could run a mono-attacking Curse Restock set to try and alleviate this longevity, and it was decent. It was also a much better Snorlax answer, but it was rather specific. So you might wonder, why Curse? Why not Meditate? Well, generally speaking, the defense boost was quite useful for letting Machamp boost in front of a boosted Snorlax without getting obliterated, and in fact actually win the one-on-one, which was hugely important. Additionally, it was nice to make it much more difficult to revenge kill through Cloyster or Gengar's Explosion, or Nidoking's Earthquake, in one-on-one situations where Machamp didn't have Earthquake itself and would have to boost multiple times before attempting to muscle through. Furthermore, most of the time Machamp was paired with plentiful paralysis support to compensate for its poor speed, so this wouldn't be an issue. However, it was true that the speed drop could be annoying when going for the sweep, and suddenly it was Snorlax that was outspeeding you, so sometimes Meditate could be used, but where Meditate was really common was on Baton Pass teams, of which Machamp was a fixture. There, once Smeargle got the Agility Pass off, you weren't going to undo it with Curse. Machamp was a staple on Agility Pass teams because it hit so hard. All it generally needed was the help with speed, and thus on a good day, it could rip through just about everything. However, Baton Pass teams and Meditate as a whole were niche, yet Machamp was the exact opposite. It was one of the scariest beasts in GSC OU, and a staple for it. Cross-chop accuracy willing anyway. Machamp received several tools to become even scarier in Generation 3. The lack of maxed out EVs on every Pokemon in favor of a new 508 max system meant it was hitting much harder on average, especially with the introduction of Natures, allowing it to crank its attack even higher. Furthermore, Bulka was a direct improvement over Curse, and it could even become more immediately ferocious with a Choice Band attached. The Guts ability also meant that usually debilitating status would actually make it far stronger, and it could even unleash one of the strongest attacks in the game, Focus Punch, with Stab. However, Machamp also had plenty of pertinent problems. The predominant 508 EV limit worked against it, as it was now far easier to take advantage of its average bulk, especially as the game had gotten faster and Machamp's speed was even less impressive. The game hadn't just gotten faster with the EV limit and new threats, but also with the introduction of Permanent Sand, which sliced into Machamp's longevity something fierce, and even multi-layered spikes on top of that. Thus, Machamp might hit hard, but it was going to be tough to find it opportunities, and it wouldn't last long. And since this may as well be describing Metachamp, it's easy to see why most players preferred the faster, stronger Metachamp if they were going to use the then unusual choice of a fighting type in a metagame that, yes, did have many fighting weak Pokemon, but also had many Pokemon that naturally took fighters on. The likes of Salamence and Celebi were lurking at every corner. Thus, for a long time, Machamp languished in BL. Obviously far too strong for UU, you, but without much it could do in OU. Then, in the wake of a newfound exploration of fighters for their ability to pose a challenge to standard dominate Skarn Bliss teams, Machamp 2 was explored, and it established itself as a genuine threat. Fighting Stab was valuable since it not only tore through Tyranitar and Blissey, but wasn't stopped by the physical wall Swampert and Skarmory, should there be sufficient strength, and Machamp powered through them with aplomb. These teams were generally on the slower side, and thus Champ's speed was just right for getting the jump on them. Furthermore, with Guts, it was completely unafraid of their go-to partner, Gengar, whose Will-O-Wisp would only make it stronger, and who wouldn't be able to hurt it much before getting knocked out otherwise. With Bulk Up's defense boost, even Explosion wouldn't hurt it much. The boost also guarded against revenge-killing attempts from Dugtrio and Aerodactyl. How about getting Champ on the field? What with its awkward defensive profile? That wasn't a problem when paired with the favorite teammate of every fighter, Baton Pass Zapdos, who wielded the move like a U-turn out of Blissey switches. Machamp would rarely sweep outright, but it would leave the opposing team so badly battered by the time it was done that picking up the pieces would be a piece of cake for its teammate. Bulk Up 3 attacks Machamp was the go-to, with Hidden Power Bug letting it tear through Celebi and Claydol, while HP Ghost was useful to more immediately threaten Gengar. But some players experimented with the higher risk and higher reward of Choice Band and its immediate power. The high crit rate Cross Chop was especially devastating, ripping past Salamance's Intimidate for a one-hit KO, and if Machamp could launch a fully powered Focus Punch, everything was getting crushed. It had a 37.5 chance to one-hit KO Skarmory of all things. Machamp remained the specific choice because it was rather unspectacular against faster offensive teams and had to compete with Hariyama, which wasn't as strong but packed much greater bulk and a massive HP stat, more conducive to switching into Blissey's Seismic Toss. Overall though, Machamp was a very dangerous sleeper pick in Gen 3 OU. Say hello to one of the most obnoxious Pokemon of all time, Generation 4 Machamp, which was blessed with the No Guard ability, meaning every attack while it's on the field will hit. Sure, you could say that it's annoying that the opponent is guaranteed to hit their move against you even if it's Focus Blast, but a big part of Machamp's business was messing up opponents' plans of making a move at all, because No Guard also meant it couldn't miss Dynamic Punch. Forget Cross Chop or the new Close Combat, even the latter's higher power was no match for the guaranteed confusion of Dynamic Punch. Unless you were a Ghost type or own Temple Slowbro, which was actually used a few times because of how irritating Machamp was, you were getting confused, and have fun with your 50% chance to smack yourself for a little bit of chip damage instead of doing something useful, while Machamp continues barraging you, or freely switches out if it doesn't want to risk it. Oh, and for those Ghost types, it can strike them with Payback, which in Gen 4 also does double damage on the switch. Speaking of niche counters, Spiritomb was also used a few times because it was a ghost that could take Payback, but the ghosts you wanted to be using, especially Platinum and onwards, with the introduction of the Rotom appliances, weren't so fortunate, and it's not like you could spam a ghost on every team anyway. Oh, and No Guard also meant Machamp couldn't miss Stone Edge either, just to really rub it in. Fun fact, No Guard also allowed Machamp to hit semi-invulnerable Pokemon, which seems just like a fun fact since nobody's using Fly or Dig competitively, until you remember that Gyarados uses Bounce, and even Gyarados is often used as a champ check. Then it absolutely makes sense that there have been tournament games where Gyarados will bounce into the air and Machamp would hit it while bouncing. The mechanic is quite obscure, so even seasoned players would often be surprised by it. Anyway, it was quickly clear that the best partner for Machamp would be Paralysis Spam, since it not only slowed the opponent down and gave the slow Machamp more opportunity, but made them even less likely to be able to move, since they would both be paralyzed and confused. Parafusion, as it was called, was nightmarish, and Paralysis Spam or Paraspam teams quickly became among the most dangerous and hated around, especially since Machamp made for such a wonderful pairing with that other despised threat, Iron Head Jirachi. Paraspam teams, almost by their very nature, could be inconsistent, and thus their usage wasn't super high. They had better times than others, such as early in Diamond and Pearl, and then again during the last months before Latias's ban in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and then much later during DPP's evolution as a past generation, but we'll get to that later. Additionally, Machamp was not solely dedicated to Paraspam, of course. It was a fierce threat in and of itself, and several offensive teams enjoyed its use as a wall breaker, not just for its confusion mayhem, but for its sheer damage dealt, which made it so difficult for defensive teams to keep up with. Nowhere was this more clear than in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver metagame with Lead Machamp. The Lead metagame is one of the most defining features of Gen 4 OU, and it basically centers around a mix of getting Stealth Rock, denying the opponent's Stealth Rock, and and or punishing the opponent for getting Stealth Rock. Machamp was absolutely in the punishing category, and what was particularly annoying was that it could also be in the denying category solely off of the confusion luck. You wanted rocks with your Swampert or Hippowdon? Well, good luck. Most of the time though, Machamp was just shredding the opponent's lead, packing Lum for status, enough bulk to withstand pretty much any attack being thrown at it, even Azel's Psychic and Life Orb Dragonite Draco Meteor, and Bullet Punch for Focus Sashers. Machamp absolutely dominated almost every common lead. Besides the aforementioned Swampert, Hippo, and Azel, there was also Aerodactyl, Heatran, Roserade, Dragonite, Gliscor, Mamoswine, Infernape, Empoleon, and even Smeargle. You couldn't exactly switch out to easily check it either, because that same bulk that let Machamp dominate the lead metagame also meant it dominated one-on-one matchups against whatever you cared to throw at it. Many a Rotom A tried to Will-O-Wisp it, activated the Lum Berry, and got paybacked hard for their troubles. Alternatively, Champ could take advantage of the Wisp and switch to its favorite teammate Heatran for a Flash Fire boost and get a free Stealth Rock. The only common lead at the time that handled Machamp was Lum Berry Metagross, which of course meant Occa Berry Metagross was not safe. It cannot be overstated just how completely Machamp destroyed the lead metagame and then reshaped it in its image. New leads were being crafted just to handle Machamp, and thus Machamp was the lead metagame. So many leads were either Machamp or leads that beat Machamp. Heatran began running Choice Specs Overheat, Azelf began running Life Orb Psychic or Choice Band Zen Headbutt, and Dragonite began running Choice Band Outrage just to get the surprise turn 1 KO. Alternatively, if you wanted a good old stealth rocking Azelf, goodbye Focus Sash, hello Colbur Berry. Choice Specs Zapdos leads popped up, running Hidden Power Flying to drop Champ. Gallade was used because it was itself like a lead Machamp that beat opposing Machamp. Anything went if it meant dealing with Machamp. Aerodactyl dropped its beloved Sash and used Power Herb Sky Attack. And what happened? Machamp equipped a Focus Sash. Boom, tables turned. No one dared status Machamp anyway, and now it was even scarier since with Sash, it no longer needed to run bulk and could thus afford max speed, meaning it could outpace and potentially mess up even the slower Lum Metagross. Eventually, the lead metagame wound up massively over-preparing for Machamp, Sash included. Gyarados started popping up as a lead, more Zapdos leads in general, not just Specs. Colbur Zelf kept on trucking. There was even a Lum Berry Heatran going around with HP and defense sufficient to survive Dynamic Punch and Bullet Punch. Crobat was genuinely popular. With all these anti-Champ techs flying around, it actually wound up being counterproductive to run Champ. It really was a victim of its own power. It was suffering from success. However, it still seemed like all Machamp did was win. Though the lead set died down, non-lead Machamp continued to terrorize the meta. For many teams, it was as simple as taking a lead Machamp and shifting it outside the lead slot. If Machamp could threaten fully healthy teams, imagine what it could do once Stealth Rock had been set up and you couldn't pivot around it with Gyarados nearly as well. This Machamp was also less dependent on its item than the Lum versus Sash dilemma of the lead, and Custap Berry saw serious usage and success, so much so that it became the new standard. Machamp tended to get knocked down to low health a lot, and its low speed meant it was easily revenge killed at that point. But with Custap, it moved first and pick off that Flygon or whatever other Pokemon foolish enough to try and finish it. This paired especially well with Substitute, which would also fit on this moveset to make itself more threatening since it didn't need Bullet Punch the same way the lead did. Speaking of sub, Paraspam teams with Machamp came roaring back in full force, newly optimized. And if there was one thing that made people hate DPPOU, it was these teams. They weren't just dice rolling cheese either. They were genuinely threatening in their own right. The dice rolls just made them even harder to deal with. Ironhead Jirachi chaining flinches was one thing, but Rachi is a weak Pokemon. Remember, Machamp only needs 8 dynamic punches or less to ruin your team, because it hits hard. There were many ways of dealing with such teams, of course. They particularly disliked Toxic Spikes, and the reintroduced Latias threatened them as much as it could assist them, but many argued the dynamic they introduced to the tier was overall negative. In more recent times, some top players have even called for Machamp's ban. A Jirachi ban is an old hat at this point, but more and more players have become disillusioned with the chaos caused by the easy click that is Dynamic Punch. We weren't kidding about that Slowbro usage. It was high level tour play, and it was really just for Machamp. Machamp doesn't have to be a cheesy dice rolling Pokemon. Its use on effective teams is as effective as ever, but it does enable such strategies to a questionable degree, at the very least. Either way, Machamp was one of the most unique, defining Pokemon in Generation 4 OU. Perhaps inspired by its travails in singles, Machamp saw a surprising amount of use in Gen 4 VGC, despite not really seeming tailored for doubles. But hey, who can argue with No Guard Dynamic Punch? It even packed Lumberry for Dark Void Smeargle. Plus, its Rock Coverage and Rock Slide was a spread move, adding a nice bit of utility. Of course, Machamp's low speed and bulk were especially exploitable in the 2-on-2 format, but that didn't stop it from being used a few times. In 2009, Huey Ha used a Machamp team built by Makiri, aka Zero Wing, designed both to abuse Trick Room or be anti-opposing Trick Room depending on the matchup. Huey used this to win the seniors division of the San Francisco Regionals. Then in 2010, despite the restricted Pokemon coming down to play, Machamp appeared again. Albert Boss reached second at the Spanish Nationals, and Julian Applefeller reached second at the German Nationals in the senior division. His Trick Room supported Machamp, heroically dealing massive damage to Kyogre with Dynamic Punch. Kyogre then promptly hit itself in confusion and did not get another attack off before being KO'd. Bless Machamp. Machamp followed up its breakout performance in Gen 4 with a completely forgettable one in Gen 5. Okay, Payback no longer hitting for double damage on the Switch hurt it, but there were far greater issues. Forget OU play at all, because Conkeldurr existed and it outclassed Champ in every way. It was bulkier, it was stronger, and it even had better priority, Mach Punch. This was a deal breaker in the much faster, stronger metagame that was Gen 5, and Champ's Dynamic Punch antics couldn't keep up, so it fell to UU. And there it was great, right? Doesn't Gen 5 UU famously look like Gen 4 OU? Well, yes, but Machamp isn't one of the reasons for that in practice. It wasn't bad, as in if you used it, it'd probably do pretty decent, but finding a reason to actually use Machamp was tough, because for as well as it performed in battle, there was probably a fighter that would have done the job better. The UU metagame naturally was quite hostile to Machamp, with great defense to it everywhere. Regenerator Slowbro, Intimidate Quillfish, Cofagrigus, the utterly perfect answer that was Sableye, and Machamp struggled to keep up against the most offensive side of things, with the likes of Togekiss, Mew, Crobat, Victini, Nidoqueen, and Zapdos running around. It was just much easier and more consistent to go with the likes of Heracross, Mienfoo, Scrafty, Cobalion, or Virizion. Generation 5 pretty much totally passed Machamp by. There were a few attempts to recapture that Dynamic Punch magic, but to no avail, and there's a life lesson in that, we think. If Machamp struggled to keep up in Gen 4 VGC, that went doubly so far for the massively power-crept Gen 5, especially with Conkeldurr as competition. However, a few trainers still persisted, whether motivated by Elite Four Karen or some other advantage, and thus Machamp got a few uses. In 2012, Ben Kiriko used it to reach second at the UK Nationals, and Dewey reached top 4 at the San Jose Regionals. Then in 2013, Hayden McTavish used it to win Worlds in the senior division, and it wasn't just on his team either, it was used in the final battle. Hayden utilized Machamp's confusion antics as an advantage over Conkeldurr, pairing it with Thunderwave Thundurus for Parafusion and Swagger Cresselia for, well, as much confusion as possible. Furthermore, Machamp now had Wide Guard, which allowed it to support its teammates against spread moves. Machamp was still going to struggle against the Latioses and weather boosted sweepers of the metagame, yet it found itself not just a small niche, but some serious success. Machamp very much enjoyed the buffed knockoff in Generation 6, but it wasn't going to compete in an OU tier that now wasn't just power crept, but also full of fairy types, so it returned to UU, and this time around, it was much better, making effective use of the new Assault Vest to bring new depth to its game. It was now a solid special hit taker without losing any of its attacking capabilities. In fact, the extra hit taking helped bring out the most of its attacking, as it could shrug off Hydreigon's Draco Meteor, which helped accentuate its superb Dark Pulse resist, and it also didn't have to instantly fear Florges' Moonblast. Well, could Machamp do anything back to Florges? Oh yes, very much so. Machamp is a lot heavier than Florges, which means its Heavy Slam did amazing damage to it. Machamp was quite good in UU throughout X and Y and into ORAS. Some players even experimented with Choice Band, dealing out Dynamic Punches redolent of death itself. If it didn't take you out through sheer damage, the confusion would push you over the edge. Resist not only struggled to withstand the power, but even more threatened by Machamp's coverage, usually just knockoff, though Stone Edge also excelled at shattering Crobat. Immunities? Yeah, have fun switching your Doublade into that knockoff. The problem came about when Conkeldurr dropped to UU. Yup, Machamp completely disappeared into Conch Shadow, and it didn't drop to RU. So wait, you just remembered reading somewhere that Conkeldurr was actually so horribly broken in UU that it got banned. Did Machamp make a glorious comeback? Unfortunately, no. In adapting to the much better conk, the tier was more than sufficiently well equipped to manage Champ. Plus, there was a new Assault Vest fighter running around and defining the tier now, Yin Xiao. Thus, Machamp ended Generation 6 uneventfully. Once again, Machamp continued to see usage in Gen 6, more than ever before, which on one hand was puzzling given power creep, fairy types, and Talonflame, but on the other made perfect sense since stab fighting was superb in Mega Kangaskhan the metagame, if you could prevent Mega Kangaskhan from clocking your Machamp first, that is. But hey, that's what teammates with tactics like Intimidate are for, or Trick Room. Under Trick Room, if you had Talonflame handled anyway, Machamp could pose quite a threat. Machamp could sometimes even help handle Talonflame itself, since in addition to Wide Guard, it could also pack Quick Guard, and Wide Guard itself was also superb support for rock slides aimed at a teammate like Mega Charizard Y. Machamp was hardly consistent, which is why its impact on the metagame was minimal, but it had a smattering of placements anyway. Those were in 2014, Joshua Edwards 3rd, Virginia Regionals, Alex 2nd in the Senior Division at the Melbourne Regionals, Amabon 13th at the Asia Cup Indonesia Qualifiers, and Tiffany Stanley at 37th and Marcus Liu 4th at Worlds. Additionally, in the 2014 metagame but for the 2015 season, Nikolai Zelinsky 7th at the Phoenix Regionals and Justin Burns 6th at the Houston Regionals. In 2015 proper, Andrew Hovis 12th at the Missouri Regionals, Daniel McFadden 3rd at the Perth Regionals, Thomas Selby 12th at the Melbourne Regionals, Callum Witt 60 at the Australian Regionals, and in 2016, the restricted metagame, Machamp was used just once on Tim Walsh's team 6th at the Melbourne Regionals. We are left to wonder what is it that caused Machamp's popularity in Australia relative to the rest of the world in Gen 6 VGC. It's because of them that Machamp didn't do half bad for a Pokemon without a real defined niche. Generation 7 brought more power creep and more fairy types, sending Machamp tumbling down to RU, and in this new home, it was excellent. There was a twist though. Now Machamp was running Guts, with close combat as a stab attack instead of the no-guard dynamic punch that had been its trademark for so long. What it lost in confusion, it made up for in power, especially since RU was an incredibly status-heavy tier, which Machamp loved running to its advantage. The Assault Vest set returned with a vengeance. Yeah, the close combat special defense drop seemed counterintuitive, but Machamp wasn't trying to last forever, just long enough to dish out big damage, and it wanted that damage to be huge. The AV gave it more opportunities to dish out that CC, and limited revenge killing afterwards, since even if the special defense boost cancelled out, Machamp was quite a decent hit taker. It could spam CC without as much fear of immediately getting checked afterwards. Plus, Guts was just too good at punishing the many Scald burns flying around the tier. And speaking of burns, that was Machamp's other set, the Flame Orb Wall Breaker, taking it upon itself to ensure it got that Guts boost. What made it such an apt Pokemon to be burned on both sets was the fact that burn damage had been nerfed to 6.25%, meaning Champ was reaping the benefits of the Guts boost with the minuscule drawback. Forget Protect stalling it, that would be feasible with the 12.5% burn of previous gens, but not now. Machamp unleashed its flurry of Guts boosted rage on the tier, with Facade hammering opponents particularly hard. It was just as spammable as close combat in this regard, but with the benefit of crushing common fighting resist that would attempt to soak CC. Most fight resist still got absolutely clobbered by Guts close combat though, especially since Champ could follow it up with Guts Bullet Punch against faster targets, a move it generally enjoyed for its anti-Gardevoir and Deancey properties. But Machamp was not without flaws. In addition to its usual low speed and lack of longevity, it also had serious competition in Pangoro and Beware, both of which packed Swords Dance. However, Machamp was far from outclassed. Those two wished they could reap a Guts facade like Machamp could, and so Machamp was a solid Pokemon in Gen 7 RU. Somehow, Machamp managed to scrape 2 uses in the Intimidate and Fairy-laden 2017 VGC metagame. The limited Pokedex helped to be sure, and statistically, it's probably not that strange. We can only speculate if Machamp's Gen 1 status played a role in it, but what we can tell you is that despite even less of a niche in Gen 7 than in Gen 6, Sam Parton rocked Machamp en route to a 6th place finish at the Toronto Regionals, and Matias Caricio brought home a 4th place finish with Champ at the Chile special event. Sam Parton was using Scope Lens Machamp because Crit Dynamic Punch and Stone Edge might just be the most unfair thing in history. Machamp returned to Ryu in early Generation 8, but it didn't leave much of an impact. It just kind of did Machamp things without being overwhelming, as it was ought to do at this point given its low speed in tandem with its lack of longevity or serious bulk. A bit of new toy syndrome was also a factor. Despite the limited Pokedex leading one to think maybe Machamp goes to UU this time, UU was actually more interested in the newly introduced Surfetch'd, who was faster, stronger, and packed coverage options Machamp lacked in Brave Bird and First Impression. However, UU began warping itself around balanced course with Milotic, Umbreon, Noivern, and Galarian Weezing, which Surfetch'd struggled against, but a certain pair of RU pokes absolutely devoured such cores. Machamp didn't just shred them all with Facade, but it also did repeatedly with Wish support from Vaporeon, ensuring it wouldn't get worn down. The two were so good at this, they rose from RU and became UU proper, helping define the new shape of the tier with their effectiveness as anti-balance tools. Machamp remained strong in UU for some time, but eventually Pangoro came to outclass it. Galarian Weezing started to fall off in popularity, making Pangoro's secondary Dark Stab knockoff far more threatening, while Pangoro also useful as a soft check threats like Polteageist and Necrozma. So when the Isle of Armor DLC dropped, so too did Machamp. Back to RU. This time around, the RU player base realized just what Machamp was capable of, and what it was capable of was messed up. It wasn't immediately banned, but it didn't last long either. Just under 3 weeks went by and Machamp ate a quick ban because, and this is true, it did not have a single defensive counter. Even Sableye, formerly a perfect answer, got thrashed by Guts Heavy Slab. Vileplume, the tier's go-to fighting answer, was absolutely obliterated by Facade. This level of overwhelming power was decidedly unhealthy, and the player base was positively screaming for Machamp's head at the time of its ban. Champ couldn't find much of anything to do in this new UU, so it sat in RUBL until the Crown Tundra dropped, and with this new power creep, it dropped all the way down to NU, alongside its initial Gen 8 rival, Surfetch'd. For some time, they appeared to simply be your average slower hard-hitting wall breakers, a perfectly normal niche, but once again, eventually the player base realized the kinds of monsters they had in their hands and began abusing them to the fullest. Surfetch'd ate a quick ban, but Machamp was put for a suspect test. On one hand, it seems obvious. The idea of Guts Machamp running around any NU tier is hilarious, but on the other hand, what was the issue for a Pokemon that was not fast and subject to getting worn down uncomfortably quickly? Wouldn't you just have to play around it like any wall breaker? Yeah, about that. Machamp got way too many opportunities to throw its attacks around because the tier's power and speed level was generally low, letting Machamp feast repeatedly. Okay, but it's still getting worn down, right? It's a wall breaker that has to be really careful with its health after all. Yeah, remember that Vaporeon Machamp duel from early UU? It's back again, and this time it didn't even have to be Vaporeon. It could also be Sylveon. These two Wishers were amazing Pokemon in their own right, and they excelled at healing Champ back up so it could come in and bludgeon the opponent again. Machamp wasn't trying to sweep teams, but it was far too difficult to stop it from getting 2 KOs. To pretty much always achieve this is downright incredible, and well, broken. As a result, Machamp was banned from NU. That was the end of the line for it, as it wasn't going to be breaking into the new RU with Heracross, Lucario, Pangoro, Beware, and Toxicroak running around, but that was just fine, as Machamp had already had a massively successful Generation 8. Machamp's Gigantamax form, giving it the crit rate raising G-Max Cheese Strike, prompting its use a grand total of once in 2020. Nicholas Vela reached 62nd with it at the Melbourne Internationals. Beyond this, Machamp did not exist at all in Gen 8 VGC. And that's it. So how great was Machamp actually? Well, it got off to a rough start in the first generation, but once Gen 2 came around, it took off and established itself as one of the scariest Pokemon around. Thus began a 3-generation tenure as an OU threat. It was BL in Gen 3, but a very dangerous niche Pokemon for its ability to cut through common teams, while it was OU proper and highly feared in Gens 2 and 4, blasting apart King Snorlax in the former and revolutionizing the lead metagame and paralysis spam in the latter. Gen 5 brought Conkeldurr and knocked Machamp down to UU, where it was generally outclassed and was more or less passed over. In Gen 6, it was quite good in UU for a while, then Conk dropped and Machamp never recovered. Even after Conk's ban in Gen 7, it was finally allowed to drop to RU, and there it excelled, taking advantage of the new burn mechanics to dish out gutsy pain for the first time since Generation 3. Then in Gen 8, Machamp had a whale of a time in all of UU, RU, and NU, getting banned from the latter two in the Isle of Armor Grimer and Crown Tundra respectively. It's not much of a VGC Pokemon, but it's had some uses here and there too. So all in all, Machamp is as fiercely competitively as its appearance would suggest. When that no guard dynamic punch comes at you, hasta la vista, baby. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Machamp? How would you buff it? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continuing supporting our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazan Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray, Daniel Isbeast, Glitcherton, Alex Sabo, Funky, Skylaria, and Chica Chihyo for their support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.